discussion. We appreciate it, and without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Parks.
Hello, everyone. It's so wonderful to be here with all of you tonight. I very much appreciate the hospitality and inviting me to speak with all of you this evening. As mentioned, this is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. My research in women, gender, and sexuality during the Holocaust is something that really fuels the work that I do at the Holocaust Center in Farmington Hills, Michigan. And I think it, as we'll explore tonight, there are so many unexplored avenues of women's experiences during the Holocaust that are really unfortunately underrepresented in the broader narrative. And so we'll talk a little bit tonight of why that is. Why do we not talk broadly about women's experiences? And then we'll sort of go through a bit of the timeline, if you will, of the Holocaust and talk about how, if you just adjust the lens a little bit differently, if you look at it through women's perspective, what happened to women as women, how we can see that that's a bit of a different story than the one that we often tell. So I will start sharing my screen now. Nope, that's not it. There we go. All right, can everyone see that? Perfect. All right, so I think, to start, we have to start with this broader, larger question. When we think about the Holocaust, when we think of the over 6 million people that are murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators, it's a really unimaginable number, right? We can't really picture that in our heads. However, we have to ask ourselves, when we do picture that, what are we picturing? Because the names that often come to mind when we talk about the Holocaust are often Hitler and Himmler and Goering. And perhaps, maybe we're thinking of a name that's not a perpetrator name. Maybe we're going to think about Elie Wiesel or Primo Levi, right? Survivors that are prolific writers. Unfortunately, what all of those names have in common is they're male names, right? So most of the time we focus on the male perpetrator story, not even the male survivor story. And most of the time we're leaving out the experiences of women. So it's important, of course, to study women's experiences during the Holocaust because looking at women's experiences of gender, it leads us to a finer, more richly nuanced understanding of the Holocaust. And more than anything, I would argue that it's an accurate understanding of the Holocaust. If you are not addressing women's issues, if you are not learning about women's issues during the Holocaust, if you have museums and college classes that are only talking about this overarching narrative of the Holocaust that doesn't include women, you're not talking about the Holocaust, right? You're talking about male experiences during the Holocaust, which is extremely important. Please don't misunderstand me. And yet, that's not the entire story. So, tonight we're going to explore a little bit of women's experiences under Nazi control. We're going to focus on them as Jewish victims, as survivors. We're going to talk about how women risked their lives to save one another and to help during one of the darkest times in human history. And we're going to do so particularly by looking at gender as this construct for a larger historical understanding. So, gender as an analytical framework for looking at history is so unbelievably important. And this definition by Joan Scott is particularly one of my favorites. She says gender is a constitutive element of social relationships based on perceived differences between the sexes. And gender is a primary way of signifying relationships of power. It's the relationships of power part that are the most important words in that definition, right? When women are targeted during the Holocaust, they are targeted as women. They are targeted as lesser, not just because they're Jews, but also because of their sex and their gender. And that's something that really colored their individual experiences and the way that they experienced this time period, the way that they lived, the way that they died, and the way that we, of course, remember them. So if all of this is true, then of course we have to ask ourselves, how did we get here? Right? How do you get to a place where we as a society erase the dominant narrative of women during the Holocaust? And, if you look sort of throughout a timeline, if we will, starting in the 1960s, when gender becomes a really important tool for historical analysis, it's happening at about the same time in the United States as the women's movement. We also see that the academic study of women in the 60s, while it is very innovative, it's also not aiming to rewrite history, right? Nobody at this time is saying that we should completely erase everything that we've already learned about the Holocaust. What they're specifically saying is that we should look at it from a different perspective, again, from that different lens. Although, of course, critics very much feared that this was not going to happen, that people were going to actually erase other accounts in lieu of women's accounts. Some of the earliest feminist historians that are studying the Holocaust at this time period, they're concerned really with the stories of women being absorbed into the larger stories of male experience during the time period. And they rightfully were very worried that people were going to boil down the descriptions of lives, of individual lives, into a holistic event, completely ignoring the variety of experiences, including gender being one of those signifiers, and how these experiences play a role on their differences and how they experience the Holocaust differently. The first Holocaust museums are being built in the 1980s, 1990s, and their exhibits are informed by academic research, which is fantastic. And yet, their exhibits largely ignore women's experiences. So again, it's not because it's not there, right? It's not because we don't have a plethora of survivor testimony. It's not because we don't have academic research or secondary research of any kind. What they say, they argue that women's experiences detract from the more fundamental fact that people were targeted as Jews, not as men, women, children, but as one category of people. Other critics, of course, which I think is perhaps a more compelling argument, they argue that women's experiences can be uncomfortable. And I want us to kind of sit in that for a second because we're literally talking about a genocide of over 6 million people, the murder and dehumanization of over 6 million people. And yet, women's issues are the ones that are uncomfortable, right? Talking about things like menstruation, loss of menstruation, pregnancy, ending of pregnancies, sexual assault, rape, right? We don't often want to assume that women are violent. All of these things are components of people's lived experience during the Holocaust. And again, if we can talk about the murder and dehumanization of all of these people, then why can we not talk about these issues as well? And I, of course, would argue, as I'm sure you've ascertained by now, that we should. I think we have to move away from this idea that women and men and children and everyone experienced the Holocaust in exactly the same way. Because, of course, they didn't. And they all had a variety of different experiences, and the denial of difference does nothing to help us understand more about this time period and to be able to teach it to future generations. We just merely cannot silence the stories of women, the experiences of women, of victims, of survivors because of mere sexism in the past and in the present. And of course, we hope not in the future. So, of course, where do we begin, right? It's a very large history. And of course, we absolutely will not get to everything tonight. But when we think about the beginning of sort of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party's reign in Germany, particularly the start in 1933, there's a significant number of women, German women, that end up voting for Hitler. Not necessarily a landslide, as previous historians have argued, but women vote for Hitler in about the same numbers as their male counterparts. This isn't particularly a shock, right? At this point in history, feminism is not necessarily equality of the sexes, right? Feminism at this point is much more having an overwhelming amount of control in your specific realm. So for women being sort of the head of the house and the family, and men being the head of society and the public life, that sort of separate spheres, separate but equal, we'll call it, which, I will argue till the day is long, separate but equal is never equal. But this concept, this is what feminism is sort of based on at this time. So it's not really that surprising that women are voting for Hitler in this respect. In the Nazi Party newspaper, I'll read for you, and I quote, they say, in reality, the granting of so-called equal rights to women, as demanded by Marxism, does not confer equal rights at all, but constitutes the deprivation of rights, since they draw women into a zone where they can only be inferior. It places women in situations where they cannot strengthen their position with regard to men and with society, but it only weakens them. Right? So this is how, under Nazi control, they're going to start quickly coordinating women under this role of mother, of homemaker, of trying to reduce them purely to their biological functions. And women in particular are supposed to adhere to this ideology of, children, kitchen, and church. Right? This is what women in Nazi Germany are supposed to do. They're supposed to be mothers and moralizers of the nation. And you can see that even from this propaganda poster here, right? It's not so subtle necessarily. Now, it may not also look that nefarious, perhaps, on the surface, but what this is actually doing is it's showing you an unprecedented level of government control in everyday German lives. So you have the child who's at the center of the photo with the mother and father and this so-called perfect Aryan family around them. And of course, what's engulfing them is the eagle being the state. And so this is largely different from the era before this, where women are getting the right to vote in Germany, where they've worked in mass outside of the home during and after World War One. And yet, of course, women are supposed to go back to the home and be mothers and moralizers of the nation. That is the goal. Of course, the Nazis are going to do many different things. They're going to outlaw birth control and abortion for German women. These terms are getting a little bit murky, which you may notice, and in a second I'll explain more about that. But they are going to outlaw birth control and abortion, as I mentioned, in an effort to raise the birth rate in Germany. They're going to give women actual military distinctions called the Mother's Cross, depending on how many children you have in society, basically denoting that men get distinctions for their sacrifices on the battlefield and women get distinctions for their sacrifices in the home, on the home soil, by having more children. So really, all the way around, their ideal Aryan woman in Germany is supposed to be this mother who is teaching the next generation how to be raised in the National Socialist state. Now, all of that is well and fine, other than the fact that I kept saying words like German and German women, and there's a very particular sect of German women that they are not talking to, right? Jewish women, Jewish German women at this time are, of course, not considered to be valuable to the Nazi state. They are not being encouraged to procreate more. When abortion and birth control is banned for so-called Aryan women, it is still encouraged for Jewish women. They are, of course, told that they are negatively impacting society, all of the propaganda and the awful anti-Semitism that we all know and understand. And really, this is where we see so many of these women being pushed out of different social circles in society. And yet they were the ones, in many respects, Jewish women, who were voting for equality of the sexes before the Nazis come to power. So there are many Jewish women that are fighting for emancipation before the Nazis come to power at the end of World War One. They are working in different feminist movements that are trying to shape not only life for Jewish women, but all women in Germany. And they, in large part, are educated, they're working outside of the home. And yet, of course, when the Nazis come to power, all of these welfare organizations that they're part of, social organizations, are going to come to a complete halt because the establishment of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in Germany brought all attempts for Jewish and female emancipation to an abrupt end. And of course, they're going to be targeted in a myriad of different ways that we'll see as we continue. So Jewish women under the Nazi regime are, of course, targeted right away, as are their male counterparts in 1933. But women are particularly targeted for their reproductive abilities, as I mentioned earlier. These attacks are primarily done through anti-Semitic legislation. You can see here Gisela Bach a historian, she argues that women have been hailed as mothers of the race, or in stark contrast, vilified as the ones guilty of racial degeneration. So again, you can see that difference of how are these different types of women being treated. So while of course some women are considered valuable, other women are being targeted through these slew of laws that start very, very quickly after the party comes to power. In 1933, in July, we have the Law for the Prevention of Genetically Diseased Offspring, which was an act of trying to, and I quote, clean up the genetic gene pool in Germany. This is where people are attacked for having physical or mental disabilities in some sorts of ways. In many respects, this is the precursor to the T4 program. And there are many women that are attacked under this program that are sterilized under the guise of things like schizophrenia, right? There are basically women that are classified as sexually active, that are mothers that work outside of the home, that are perhaps single, that are outspoken feminists, that are all being targeted under this guise of schizophrenia, as one example, and then sterilized as a result of that. Now, in these laws, sterilization and later euthanasia, but sterilization of women versus men is very different, right? The sterilization of women is a particularly invasive a procedure that is very dangerous, that around 5,000 women end up dying as a result of these sterilizations. Most of that, or 5,000 total, I'm sorry, but most of them are women. We also see, of course, a shift in legislation with the Nuremberg laws, right? In 1935, we know that these laws are sort of the single most damaging laws to the Jewish people, targeting them as a race, classifying them as such, and stripping them of their German citizenship. It forbade any sexual relations between Aryans and non-Aryans, and these laws really act as the legal precedent for genocide later on. But there's also other interesting laws that are a part of it that says that, it's unlawful for a Jew to employ an Aryan or domestic servant under the age of 45. You have to ask yourself, why would that be? Right? 45, they're saying end of reproductive age. And so a lot of these laws, where they don't come out and necessarily say that they're attacking women or targeting women, they absolutely are. We see the impact of things like these laws in this photo that you see here. This is a very infamous photo, and you see that there's a businessman, Oscar Danker, and his girlfriend, who is a Christian woman named Adele, who are targeted for their relationship, forced to carry around these horrifying and humiliating signs in public. And you can see that, the people around this photo are absolutely adhering to this ideology. I think the man in the back, standing right behind her, that's smiling, is always the one that sort of chills me the most, as if he's proud of these kinds of developments of people being targeted in this way in society. And of course, you can go through many more of these laws as well. But in the interest of time, I'd like to look at one individual story who was targeted through some of these anti-Semitic laws, and show how her life was completely impacted as a result of this. So many of these laws, of course, affect Jewish women across all spheres of life, social, economic, political life, eroding their gains of rights that they had already achieved, as I mentioned before. But there's an interesting way when we're teaching about these sort of underrepresented stories. We can't also only talk about women as mothers or only talk about women's reproductive livelihood. There are also women like Dr. Margaret Brent who are targeted for their businesses. She was a really interesting case. She's the first female lawyer in Prussia. And in 1925, she opens her own law office in Berlin, which was an amazing feat at the time, of course, for anyone, any woman. After in 1914, she's actually able to take the bar and focus on family law. I'm sorry, after 1919, she's able to take the bar when it's allowed for women. And she writes here what I think is very, very telling. She says, by 1933, the law firm had become the foundation of my livelihood. I had succeeded in establishing myself well enough to maintain my own office with an adequate income and was able to travel abroad repeatedly. I might want to add that I enjoyed trust, prestige, and growing recognition. She had to close her legal practice when the Nazis came to power. She was able to escape out of Europe in late 1939 and later was able to resume work as a lawyer in the United States after the war. But of course, she lost everything, right? She lost her livelihood. Her story reminds us that women's experiences, again, are not limited to the home and family life. There are Jewish women that had professional lives that were targeted for anti Semitic discrimination as well. But I think the part at the end of her testimony where she says, I might want to add that I enjoyed trust, prestige, and growing recognition, as if that part's not quite as important, or she feels funny saying that part. And I think that, for many women, we're not supposed to brag about the things that we're good at or our accomplishments. But she's trying to say that this was important to her. It was important that she had a place in society, that she was looked up to in this way. And so I think using individual stories like this one can really help people grapple with the enormity of the Holocaust and help them sort of push boundaries of what they understand to be a typical Holocaust narrative, right? We don't often talk about women that owned their own law offices being targeted for anti-Semitic discrimination and laws. Another thing that we don't technically talk about a whole lot because it can be difficult to quantify is the social exclusion of Jewish women. So, beyond even legal discrimination, of course, we have many women that discussed how it felt to be excluded in society. There's one anonymous woman, which is very interesting that she wanted to give this quote and testimony anonymously. She says, and I'll read a little bit before this, she says, since the Nazis came to power, I hadn't taken part in these gatherings. So, what she's talking about is basically ladies who lunch, right? Girlfriends getting together regularly. And she said, since the Nazis came to power, she hadn't taken part in these because she didn't want to cause any difficulties for her friends as a result of her Jewish presence. Then she says, she tried to convince me that they were all still my friends, a girlfriend of hers, so I decided to go to the next meeting, and I couldn't sleep all night the night before the gathering. I was worried about my Christian friends, but I was also worried about myself. I knew I would observe them very carefully. I would notice even a shadow of their discomfort at my entry, but I didn't have to read their eyes or note a change in their tone. The empty table in the booth where we had always met spoke loudly and clearly, but I couldn't blame them. Why should they have risked the loss of their jobs only to prove to me that Jews could still have friends in Germany? Right? That's something that we don't really talk about a significant amount, right? Not all Jews necessarily were abandoned by their friends, but the companionship that women often felt in society because they were often more assimilated than their male counterparts was something that they felt a shift in. Right? These are the women that are going to the grocery store on a daily basis. They're interacting with their neighbors. Many of them were more embedded in society in a way that sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes their husbands were not. And so, meeting these sort of mounting economic hardships that Jewish housewives were trying to really grapple with, when possible, they're trying to prepare less expensive meals, they're trying to make home clothing repairs as much as they can, and they have ever shrinking resources, but then they also have ever shrinking support in society as well. A turning point, though, in the history of the Holocaust, by any estimation, is Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, of which the anniversary of is coming up this weekend, as I'm sure we all know. And Kristallnacht, of course, is an extremely important turning point in the history of the Holocaust. I always say that if you ask 5 Holocaust historians, when did the Holocaust start? They're all going to give you different answers. If you ask them when is a significant date that things start to change in Nazi Germany, they're going to tell you 1938. They're going to tell you the events of Kristallnacht. There is no getting around it. Of course, we all know the facts that you hear all the time when you hear about Kristallnacht, right? These are a wave of anti-Jewish violent pogroms across Germany and occupied territories in November 9th and 10th of 1938. This is where Jews are attacked on the streets, in their homes, in their places of worship. 7,000 businesses and homes are damaged. 1,400 synagogues are burned. You can see these images here. Cemeteries and schools are vandalized. Police and firefighters are instructed not to intervene unless, of course, damage is spreading to Aryan properties. Hundreds are injured. Roughly 100 people are murdered. And reparations, damages for all of this are being paid by the Jewish community afterwards. And at the end of these events, 30,000 men are rounded up and taken to different concentration camps. So these stories of these men that are taken away are extremely important. And we talk about them a great deal. But do these statistics, any of those things that I said, actually detail or tell the story of how women experience Kristallnacht? And I would argue no, because while men often talk about the night of broken glass, right, denoting the broken glass of the businesses shattered in the public sphere, you also see the sort of flip of that coin that women are often referencing this as the night of flying feathers because the women are attacked in their homes. They're the ones that are attacked while their beds and their comforters and their pillows are being ripped apart, feathers being shattered and thrown all over their home. I think these pictures are some of the most haunting pictures. These women literally being barged in on in their nightgowns, in their beds, left completely unattended because most people felt that the men were the ones that were being attacked, which rightfully so, they were. They were rounding up men by the thousands. And yet they're also coming into these homes and attacking women in a very different way. There are an unknown number of women that are sexually assaulted, that are raped during Kristallnacht. This, of course, is not necessarily the first time that these things have happened, but perhaps the first time in mass. And women are really talking about these events in a lot of their testimonies through this gendered lens, even though they're not necessarily being asked that question. There are very, very few people in the 1980s on a recording testimonies of survivors saying, "How did you experience Kristallnacht as a woman?" Right? That's just not something that they're saying. And yet that's not a reason why the women are not responding in this way, right? They are talking about how they're attacked as women. And it, of course, really changes the way that we can look at this one singular event. Now, to drill down even deeper, if we look at one particular survivor's experiences of Kristallnacht, we can see how she was one of these women that was targeted and attacked in a different way than what we typically talk about as the norm when discussing the events of Kristallnacht. This is a woman named Ida Abraham that you see pictured in the passport here. She was from Frickhof in Germany, and she had a very comfortable upbringing. She learned to sew from her grandmother. She had a very loving family. Her and her husband Albrecht welcomed their son Harry, a little boy, into the world just a few months before Kristallnacht took place. During Kristallnacht, her husband and her brother were some of those 30,000 men that were rounded up and taken away, particularly Buchenwald. Now, on that night, there was a rock that was thrown through her window that landed right next to where the baby was sleeping, which would have just been horrifying to any parent. And she, of course, has to realize, how do I help the family? What do I do next? Especially as her husband and her brother are missing. She then realizes that she has to try to get them out. This is that tiny, tiny window between Kristallnacht and World War II beginning, where if you could prove that you would leave Germany, you could, in some cases, get people out of concentration camps if you promised that you would leave, and of course, leave with none of your possessions or wealth. So she killed herself, going from agency to agency to agency to try to obtain papers so that she could get them out, so that she could try to save her family as best she could. During this whole time, though, The events of Kristallnacht were not just a singular 2 night thing, right? The Nazis are telling people in the surrounding cities and towns to put pressure on their Jewish neighbors after these events, particularly where she's from. They're telling them to primarily deprive them of food. And so she doesn't know how she's going to feed her son. And yet there's a woman who would sneak her milk in the middle of the night. And that's how she was able to survive, that's how they were able to survive. I think it's a really good reminder that sometimes it can only take one person, right? Something so small as bringing someone milk, some choice, an individual choice that may seem inconsequential to one person is life-saving to another. But again, she worked tirelessly and she eventually, Ida was able to get her brother and her husband papers to secure them passage to Shanghai. So, of course, they're able to go there because there are no visa requirements. I'm not going to pretend that they're welcoming Jews with open arms into Shanghai. They're living within a ghetto in Shanghai. But they are able to go there. It is a bright spot, if you will, during the Holocaust. She actually begs her parents to leave with her then, because she then turns her sights to how do I get the rest of the family out? And unfortunately, her parents won't go. Right? Her father's a World War I veteran. He thinks that he's a patriot, that they will never come for me. And so she eventually has to take her son, Harry, and her Singer sewing machine with her to Shanghai, and she has to leave them behind. She in Shanghai is able to work in a way that her male family members are not, right? Even though they welcome them into Shanghai, that doesn't mean they want them coming in and taking jobs from other people. And yet, domestic work is seen as completely acceptable. So she becomes one of the most prominent seamstresses in the Shanghai ghetto, and that's also how she's able later able to acquire passage for the family to emigrate to the United States, where they came in 1947, settling in Cleveland, Ohio. And her son that you see here, he says, in all these moves, Ida was able to work because of her domestic skills, whereas, of course, my father was not. For the next 30 years, she actually ended up working at Sears, in charge of the production of slipcovers, and she eventually died in 2003 at the age of 93 years old. And while this is an amazing and important story, it's not necessarily unique, right? Women did what they had to do. They used their resources to the best of their abilities to try to save their families at all possible costs. There's, of course, after the events of Kristallnacht, many people that try to leave, try to get out of Germany, even though it's going to become increasingly more difficult. The image that you see here is a family, and the woman's name is Ruth Korn, who was local to Michigan in our community here. And her husband were able to get married. They emigrated. They got married in Denmark in 1939. And then they were trying to find passage to be able to emigrate to the United States. And luckily, Ruth had a very wealthy philanthropist cousin in Detroit who was able to sponsor them to come. But it is a very, very expensive journey, right? If you see the image to the left here, this is how expensive it was for them to get out. In 1942, it cost $1,688 per person, which is about the equivalent to $27,500 today per person to get them out, right? Most people don't have these kinds of resources, especially after most people are purged from their professions and haven't been working for years at this point. I should say they have been working, but not being paid fairly for working in many respects. And so she's able to get her family out, but the journey is hard. They have to go from Denmark to Russia to Japan to the United States. And they do so carrying their daughters in their twin daughters in this basket to the right that you see here. This image doesn't exactly do it justice. It's a much sort of bigger basket than this. But this is part of our permanent collection at the museum. And it's just unbelievable, and I think is a good symbol or emblematic artifact of the tenacity of women during this period to try to get their families out at all costs and much like Ida Abraham, to do what they could with what they had. Of course, again, the historical record of Kristallnacht, of what happens after, isn't complete if you don't talk about these things, right? It's not complete if you don't talk about, yes, after Kristallnacht, there's a massive wave of immigration, but in most respects, women are the ones that are spurring that immigration. They're also, in a lot of ways, the ones that are letting the men go first because they see that they're first being violently attacked and they think that perhaps that won't happen to them as well. Of course, it's important though to make sure that we look at both sides of the coin to see how are women's contributions really shaping this history, and then of course what will happen to them after this. If we now turn our attention to the ghetto system, of course, that's created in 1939 after the invasion of Poland, this is really a crucial step in the Nazi takeover of Jewish lives and the Jewish surrounding populations, particularly in Poland, forcing them into these designated ghettos under miserable conditions. I think that, so many of these images from the ghettos can never do justice, of course, how bad the conditions actually were. These images show various aspects of everyday life within the ghettos. And there are nearly 600 ghettos that are in Poland alone. And of course, we know that 90% of Polish Jewry will eventually be murdered. These are the things that we typically talk about when we talk about the ghettos, but what were women's lives like in the ghettos, right? How were they perhaps different or similar to their male counterparts? Emanuel Ringelblum, you see his quote here, was a historian, social worker, teacher who documented life, particularly inside of the Warsaw Ghetto, in what's called Notes from the Warsaw Ghetto. He was one of the leaders and organizers of the Onik Shabbat archive. If you're familiar with the story of the amazing people that recorded thousands and thousands of pieces of evidence and artifacts and pictures and writings of Jewish life in the ghettos that they ended up burying in the ground to try to keep it as a testament to what people experienced in the ghettos. This is Emanuel Ringelblum. And he's saying here that the historian of the future, of course, has to devote this fitting chapter to women because it's thanks to them that people are able to actually endure what's happening to them in the ghettos, right? He thinks that women's contributions are something that after the war, people will be talking about in volumes because of how unbelievable women are contributing in these spaces. And yet, of course, we know that that's not necessarily what ends up happening after the war. Of course, every single ghetto was different, right? It gets very difficult when you're talking about the history of the Holocaust, particularly pertaining to the ghettos and the camps. There is not one that is the same as the next. They're all different geographically, the way that they're set up administratively, and yet there are some themes that we can draw throughout. And where in the ghettos, there are some women that are working in clandestine schools to try to still educate children as best they can. They work in soup kitchens. They work in helping youth movements, various youth movements. They're also helping work in housing committees, right? Organizing each building, negotiating evictions, assisting the needy when possible. And I would argue that women are able to do this in the context of the ghettos and the camps because it's not new. It's not new to them at all, right? If we remember to women, Jewish women's lives before the Nazis come to power, they're organizing. They're working in welfare organizations. They know how to communally work together. And so they take a lot of those characteristics and ideals that they're familiar with, and they apply them into these bitter scenarios as well. Now, of course, these unique challenges for women, we can break them apart into, different sections. Um, but I think it's important to note that when we think about the ghettos as a whole, it's a significant stage not only in the persecution of Jewish people as classified as a race, but it also marks the breakdown of the Jewish family. And this is very purposefully done, right? They're targeting the Jewish family, men who are supposed to be the brave protectors of their family, that are the breadwinners, are not able to protect their families as much in the context of the ghetto, or at least it's set up to not encourage that. Women are not supposed to be able to be comforting mothers that can feed their families, take care of their children, watch their children. So the ghetto system itself is set up to break down the family. There's of course also, regardless of all of this, women are still charged with maintaining family life and normalcy in the ghettos, which they try to do at all possible costs, but becomes increasingly more and more difficult as time moves on. As example, in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1941, Jews are prohibited from marrying and having children. Again, very specifically targeting the family. Pregnant women up to 3 months are forced to have abortions. This is not unique to the Warsaw Ghetto, right? This is similar in Vilna, in the Kovno Ghetto, in Shavli Ghetto, in many different ghettos. And it's because children technically cannot contribute to a wartime economy, but more than that, they signal a Jewish future, right? And a lot of that burden falls on women because women stereotypically are supposed to be the ones that are creating the next generation, that are raising the next generation, and they're being told they're unable to do this. Now, as we move forward in our talk tonight, some of these topics are, again, very, very difficult to talk about. It's not comfortable to talk about these. But again, I would challenge us to be okay with feeling uncomfortable, right? We shouldn't feel comfortable when we're talking about the Holocaust. Yes, we want to make sure that, especially in public places like our museums and centers, that people are safely encountering this information so that they can process it and analyze it. But that doesn't mean that we have to be comfortable with everything. And I think for me, this is one of those things. Dr. Aaron Peretz was a gynecologist in the Kovno ghetto, and you can see here his quote. He says, unwittingly, they, women, would reach advanced stages of pregnancy. By an order of July 1942, pregnancy in the Kaunas ghetto was punishable with death to the father, the mother, and the infant. We had to start making abortions by the hundreds, yet there were many women who refused abortion for all the danger involved, with great courage awaited the day of giving birth. It's important to remember the conditions of the ghetto at this time. It's extremely unsanitary to be having these kinds of procedures. They don't have things like anesthesia. These women are having these abortions performed on them, mostly against their will, and then having to go to work right afterwards. It's extremely dangerous, and it's heartbreaking, right? These women, that many of them that did not want this, are of course being forced into this situation. And it's hard for the entire family, but it's also, I would argue, dually hard for these women. It is important to remember, though, that in Jewish law, the greatest value is given to the preservation of life. However, when life of the unborn child threatens that of the mother, Jewish law dictates that the latter be given preference and allows for abortions in certain cases. And so, in the Kovna ghetto, particularly, the rabbis actually came together to decree that it was permissible, it was religiously acceptable for these women to have these abortions because they're trying to help them in any possible way that they can, trying to ease this burden, even though one would argue that perhaps that's not possible. It was devastating and horrific for women. And many women also worried that these abortions would have, permanent results on their fertility if they were to survive everything. Of course, along with issues of fertility and abortion, within the camps, or I'm sorry, within the ghettos, women are also losing their ability to menstruate. Not all women, but there are large percentages of women, particularly because of both shock and lack of caloric intake, that they're losing their ability to menstruate, which some truly believed was sort of a loss of femininity in a lot of ways. Sexual assault and rape are also a concern within the ghettos. Rape between Jewish men and women, and conversely also between perpetrators to guards, the surrounding guards of the ghettos as well. So this is, of course, a very, very difficult thing to talk about. But sexual violence, of course, occurred at every stage, unfortunately, of the Holocaust. And while that didn't happen to every single woman, it was something that every single woman had to be concerned about. There's actually a testimony by a woman named Golda Wasserman, and she describes the mass rape of women in the Tolkien ghetto and in Ukraine. And I actually usually just read her quote because I think it's so difficult to get through and to hear her say it. But she says in the fall of 1942, more than 3,000 Jewish families resettled in the ghetto. Every 15 to 20 days, young women were selected for work. And she says work in parentheses. These women were sent away from the ghetto under the pretense of working in the kitchen or the bakery of the commandant of Tolkien. The girls returned having been raped, ill with venereal diseases. Many committed suicide back in the barracks, while some were killed when resisting or attempting to flee. She says it's impossible to describe what was happening in the ghetto, the desperate screams of the girls, the pleas of their parents. And then she ends her testimony by saying that she was sent to work. It's heartbreaking, right? It's a horrible thing to hear about. There are so many women that didn't want to necessarily detail in their testimonies what happened to them. It was more comfortable for them to explain to you what was happening to everyone around them, and then often say things at the end like this that that was her experience as well, and not diving much more into it. Unfortunately, this is not an isolated account, right? There are many different accounts in many different ghettos of these issues happening as well. And again, they're excruciatingly difficult topics to talk about. But truly, without these examples and challenges of life in the ghettos, we do not have a complete understanding of this history, not even a little bit. Of course, when we think about resistance in spaces of the Holocaust, we often don't think about women either. When we talk about people that escaped the ghettos, Genia Yutsky, that you see pictured here, is just an unbelievable example of this kind of spiritual, cultural, one would even argue perhaps armed kind of resistance. She was unbelievably brave. Um, she was able to escape the ghetto. And not only was she able to escape the ghetto with her son, but she had forged papers. She was able to place her son with a Polish woman so that they could perhaps try to survive until hopefully all of this ended. And she then went to work in the home of a German physician, working in the household of the home of this physician. And so it's extremely dangerous. She eventually, unfortunately, is discovered, and she and her son are taken to deported to Auschwitz, where they're murdered in 1944. But she's a really interesting example because her resistance is classified under her role as a mother. And yet, everything she does is as harrowing as any Holocaust movie that you've ever seen, right? She literally breaks free from the ghetto. She hides under the cover of night. She gets false papers. She's able to hide members of her family. She works under, a different alias in a Nazi home. And then she's eventually discovered, right? What about all of that doesn't say resistance? She's clearly resisting. And yet, because her umbrella of resistance is under motherhood, we often don't talk about her in those kinds of terms. But it's important to remember that resistance during the Holocaust was not just outside resistance, right? Jews helped Jews during the Holocaust. It wasn't just righteous people. Irina Zendler, that you see pictured here, has become more famous in recent years, particularly because of different TV shows and movies written about her. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with Irina Zendler, her story of how she was able to help saved 2,500 children from the Warsaw Ghetto. It's an amazing story, right? She doesn't do it alone. She does it with a network of people, but she's a young girl, a young social worker who says that she has to save these people and she does everything she can to try to do so. It's an amazing story. But we only talk about Irina Zendler. We don't talk about the parents that gave up their children, right? That's equally resistance as well. And so women, of course, were a part of all of these aspects of resistance during the Holocaust, even though sometimes we don't read it as such because it's couched in terms of motherhood or social work or all these different titles. There are, of course, some areas of resistance during the Holocaust that are perhaps easier for people to understand, that particularly being the resistance of couriers and partisans. Couriers during the Holocaust, many people really don't realize that from the beginning of the war, these women are unbelievable in acting as a lifeline to Jewish communities across Europe, right? They're taking news and information and papers and resources and money and weapons from ghetto to ghetto to ghetto throughout Poland. And they're the ones that are connecting people when they're cut off from the rest of society, isolated from what's happening in the rest of the world. These young girls, these couriers, are bringing information and hope into the ghettos. Now, I say young girls because it's particularly young women who don't look stereotypically Jewish that are the ones doing this. And you can see why. If there was a young man walking on the streets, why would there be a young man walking on the streets in Poland? You would either be in the war effort or you would be considered someone that's subversive, right? There's, of course, also a physical element to this as well. There's no necessary marker on a Jewish woman identifying that they're Jewish. And yet, for Jewish men that are circumcised, this would have been an obvious telltale sign that they were Jewish. And so these young girls really take on these difficult tasks in order to try to help as much as they possibly can. A lot of these women also end up as partisan members. These are people that are fighting groups, particularly in the forests, around ghettos, that are escaping from the ghettos, that are joining these partisan units that are fighting. But of course, there's twin evils of the partisan movement as well, right? These women are facing both sexist violence and anti-Semitic violence in the partisan movements. Not all partisan groups liked Jews. Just because they didn't like the Nazis doesn't mean that they did like the Jews. So there's a lot of examples of people, of women, men joining partisan units having to hide that they were Jewish until they found other people that they could connect with. But these partisans, these women, were a part of everything. Yes, they were supposed to do the so-called cooking and cleaning for the partisan groups, but they're also wielding weapons and blowing up trains and doing really important physical, violent work to fight back against the Nazis. But regardless of their immense resistance, there are many men and women that are, of course, sent to the concentration and death camps after being captured in these cases. So much like if we look at the ghettos, if we sort of progress to the camps, there are also many unique challenges that women are experiencing in the context of the camps as well. So it's not necessarily unique just to the ghettos. Again, the concentration camp system throughout Germany was and broader Europe was immense. There are over 44,000 sites of incarceration during the Holocaust. Of course, there's only 6 main extermination camps, all on Polish soil. But men and women, of course, were both subject to life and death in these spaces. And yet, women faced challenges because they were women. For many, they face the similar challenges of loss of menstruation. There are women that are entering the camp at different points. Some women are entering the camp that are getting their periods for the first time, young girls. There are some women that are losing their ability to menstruate. There are some that are suffering with the shame of bleeding in public. When we think of even just the context of uniforms that are given to people in the camps, many women are given these dress uniforms or skirt and top uniforms. They're not given undergarments, right? Which may be uncomfortable to men, but not necessarily a necessity. Whereas women are unable to staunch bleeding in many respects because they have no undergarments, they have no menstruation materials. Rags were considered like underground, like black market gold in the camps that women would barter back and forth and help one another with. while they were on their periods. There's, of course, a significant amount of sexual violence that happens during the camps. And there are many accounts of women saying that because they were on their period, they were not raped at that moment, right? As if, again, menstruation is dirty and rape is not, right? It's an unbelievable thing that's happening in the context of these spaces. But you can see this artifact to the right here is just an unbelievable artifact. This woman created her own bra out of material that she had found in the camps because that was important to her. That was her act of resistance. That was what made her feel human. And again, you can't downplay how important that was to some people. Um, of course, there are also things like shaving of hair upon entering the camps. That's a very physical, invasive thing. There are medical examinations. There are absolutely nothing medical about them. There are raping women as they're entering these camps, as a form of torture and ways of scaring them upon entering the camp. And then, of course, pregnancy is a unique concern for women in the camps. There are stories of women who would trade uniform to uniform to uniform as someone in their barracks, their stomach grew larger and larger to try to hide their pregnancies. And yet, of course, this is something that they're having to grapple with because typically, upon entering one of the camps, having a young child or being pregnant was considered a death sentence. And so we see that pregnancy is something women are worried about being pregnant. They're worried about a loss of pregnancies. They're worried about if they survive all this, will they be able to get pregnant and have another child again? And it's just, there are some historians that call this sort of a dual psychological assault on women, the thinking of the now and the future. One woman in particular that can speak to this part of the unique experiences of fertility, pregnancy within the camps is Dr. Gisela Pearl. She was a phenomenal woman who really embodies, I think, a lot of these elements that we've been talking about today. There are some sectors of society that, without their participation, the Holocaust would not have been possible. And the medical community is certainly one of them. And yet, of course, there are some Jewish doctors that chose to do the right thing, that were trying to help their fellow humans at a time when others in their profession were doing the exact opposite. Dr. Gisela Pearl was from Siget, Hungary. She came from a very loving family, spoke multiple languages. She was extremely bright, and she was imprisoned in Auschwitz, in Birkenau particularly, and the very infamous Dr. Joseph Mengele learned of her specialization as an OB, as a gynecologist. And so she was tasked with rounding up pregnant women in the camp. And she later realized that these women were actually being killed as a result of their pregnancy. She assumed that these women would be given lesser work details because of their pregnancies, but of course, this isn't the case. So, understanding that these women are marked for death, she decided to hide these pregnancies and help these women as much as possible moving forward. Under the cover of night, she would perform abortions. She would quietly deliver babies whenever she could. And then she helped to kill the newborn children so that their mothers could live to have another child another day. Right? This is a woman who wanted to bring children into the world for a living and had to invert her skills as a healer as a way of trying to save people. But that's what she did as a way of trying to help those around her. One inmate later testified at the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, saying, without Dr. Pearl's medical knowledge and willingness to risk her life by helping us, it would be impossible to know what would have happened to me and to many other female prisoners. She was the doctor of the Jews. And yet, at the same time, after the war, there are many that want to brand her as a war criminal because of what she had done. But she, again, is trying to help these people and is really emblematic of this very sort of inner spiritual, cultural resistance of women trying to help one another within the camps. Her testimony in particular that you see on the right here, I was a doctor in Auschwitz, her memoir, was published in 1948. So 1948, We're having a detailed account of what is happening to women in these camps. And yet, for some reason, we pretend like we don't understand these things or we don't know that women were experiencing these issues of abortions, of forced abortions, of rape, of all of these issues. And 1948, this is coming out. And of course, unfortunately, many people still don't know her story to this very day. Now, as we sort of conclude to the end of our talk here today, and then I'd be very happy to answer any questions that any of you have. We can't talk about women in the Holocaust if we don't also talk about women as perpetrators during the Holocaust. We see some camp guards that you see pictured here at Ravensbrück concentration camp, which is a female camp that was created for imprisoning women. Also, all of the guards at the camp were women, except for the commandant. And most people don't realize that 10% of all camp guards were women. So this isn't the only area of perpetration that women are involved in during the Holocaust. Wendy Lauer actually argues, for those of you that are interested, her book Hitler's Furies details female perpetration in a really brilliant way. And she argues that there are over 500,000 German women that would be classified as perpetrators of the Holocaust. These are women that are not only camp guards, which might be the extreme example, but they're teachers that are indoctrinating people. They're nurses selecting people for sterilization, right? These are women that unfortunately, while we assume that they are not violent, while we assume that women in general shouldn't be violent, they absolutely are. And if we don't confront that reality, then how are we actually talking about the Holocaust and how are we preventing future genocides today? One very specific and perhaps extreme example of female perpetration is a woman named Irma Grisa. She was quite infamous, particularly for her youth and her beauty at the time. And she was a guard in many different camps, including Bergen-Belsen, Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, and she became one of the highest ranking female guards possible. She, of course, was one of the most notorious figures in the camp. She testified to murdering thousands of people. She was quite sadistic in her arbitrary beatings, sexual assaults of prisoners. And while we think of women like this as being sort of the extreme end of perpetration, again, I want to remind us that many survivors say in their testimonies that these women were worse than the men. Please don't mistake me. Irma Grisa and others like her that tried to use their place in society for socioeconomic betterment by doing these horrible jobs that they very much were ideologically driven to do, make no mistake. They weren't necessarily worse than the men, though. They were doing the exact same things, but because she was a woman, people often think that women are not capable of these things. And unfortunately, her case and example shows us that that's absolutely not true, that women are capable of violence in that same way. She actually argued that she was conscripted later in her trial. She certainly wasn't. She volunteered to be a guard. These guards had to prove their ideological loyalty to the regime, of which she did. And she was later tried and hanged during the Nuremberg trials for her complete lack of humanity and deprivation. Um, it's important, again, to know, though, when studying women's agency during the Holocaust, we need to study both the good and the bad. We have to study the victims and perpetrators because both help us better understand the history of this period. So as we conclude sort of in our timeline here, the Holocaust, of course, was unimaginable, and it ended as a direct result of Allied victory on the battlefields. However, liberation, returning to life, was not something that was easily done. It was not instantaneous by any stretch of the imagination for survivors. And one last example I'd like to share with you this evening is actually of a very tiny representative artifact that we have in our exhibit, a lipstick tube that denotes this very interesting story of what happened in Bergen-Belsen at liberation. As the Allied troops again start liberating the camps, they start to find these people and realize that they are trying to help them as much as possible with supplies and resources, medicine, food. And yet there was a shipment of lipstick that was sent to Bergen-Belson's displaced persons camp after the war. It's unclear why this happened, but there's a British lieutenant, Lieutenant Colonel Mervyn Willett-Gannon, that you see here, who said, I believe nothing did more for those internees than the lipstick. Women lay in bed with no sheets and no nightie, but with scarlet red lips. He says later that that lipstick started to give them back their humanity, right? It's not a commentary on the fact that women like makeup. It's a fact that they were able to see themselves as individuals again, as feminine beings again. And it is, again, a different experience of women in the DP camps versus their male counterparts. There's also a significant amount of marriages, births, also assaults that happen in the DP camps. It's a long haul after liberation. And yet, these are just some ways that women are experiencing it. I think that the point of all of this, perhaps, is that you could do this entire talk in a million different ways. I could have chosen a million other stories to talk about women in the Holocaust, and that's the point, right? We can't talk about the Holocaust if we are ignoring women's stories. They should be accessible. They should not just be a footnote in the history of the Holocaust. These stories have to be taught in schools, in universities. They need to be on the covers of books, on the walls of museums, and they are absolutely a part of the main narrative of the Holocaust and should be treated as such. So, if we want to understand even a little bit about the present, we have to understand these stories of the past. And I would urge all of you to learn more about these sort of underrepresented women's experiences. So, thank you so much. I'm sorry I ran a few minutes over, but I'm happy to answer any questions if anyone has any of them. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Parks, for your deeply informative and moving presentation. I've had the privilege of seeing it before, and as this is my second time, I'm still learning more. So thank you. Your expertise and the women's stories during the Holocaust you shared have certainly not only given me, but I dare say, speaking on behalf of those participating, much of us to reflect on, not simply in terms of the historical facts, but also in how we apply that understanding. So thank you so much. I'd now like to transition and hand it over to my colleague Erica Nadelhaft, who serves as the Education Coordinator and Holocaust Scholar at the HHRC. Erica will moderate the Q&A portion of our program. For those joining, I invite you to join in the Q&A session. As Dr. Parks noted, unmuting yourself and also choosing to add your question in chat. And so let me see, I'm already seeing some being added to chat, so thank you. Erica, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Parks. Thank you, everybody, for being part of this lecture series. Again, as Tam said, if you have a question, a thought, or a comment, we would love to hear it. You are more than welcome to put your message in the chat or just kind of signal with a hand raise or unmute yourself and speak up. If you have a question for Dr. Parks, I'll give everyone a minute to kind of think a little bit about what they might want to ask or to say. And if nobody does have a question, I have a list. So, but I'd like you all to have the opportunity first to unmute and to speak up. In that case, I actually do have a whole bunch of questions. So I would like to kick us off. And when I was listening to this and when I was doing some reading about women in the Holocaust, before this lecture, I started thinking about the types of friendships that women often have. and that, we talk about today, even that women tend to have very, very, again, I'm generalizing, but often women have very strong female friendships in their lives. And, there's always sort of some lamenting going on that men might not necessarily have those types of friendships and support system in their lives. And so my question is, do you think that this really helped women during the Holocaust, whether in the ghettos or in the camps, in ways that obviously it didn't help men?
That's a fantastic question. I would absolutely say yes. There are many different historians that feel that because of women's communal relationships with one another, that they were able to fare better in the conditions of the ghettos and camps than their male counterparts. You hear the term camp sisters being used a lot, that women that created these networks with one another to take care of one another, regardless of if they were actual family or not. This is not to say that men do not create relationships within the camps, but they do so less willingly often, in smaller numbers. And these camp sisters, in many respects, are what people attribute their survival to. That when they wanted to give up, they had women around them telling them that they had to keep going and that that was something that really fueled them. So I really do think there is an element of women being comfortable, again, going back to their participation in welfare organizations and pre-war era. They are used to this kind of work, this kind of relationship building, in a way that men are not necessarily as familiar or comfortable with. And you do see that carried forward in the Holocaust.
Thank you. And I do just want to note that Naomi has commented in the chat that this is such an important and really relatively unknown part of the Holocaust. So I wanted to make sure to mention her comment. Any questions from anybody else or
Dr.
comments?
Parks,
Yes.
I just wanted to ask, in your studies, in this work, how did you detach enough to have your own work-life balance with such
Yeah.
intense material? How did you do self-care
That
through this
is
whole?
a fantastic question, and I am not going to pretend that I always do it well. I habitually cry in tours that I give of the museum or presentations that I do. And I used to be very self-conscious about that. And then I sort of kind of one day kind of woke up and I was like, you know what? If the worst thing that people see of me is that these things matter to me and that it makes me emotional and that maybe they should feel that way too, I think that's okay. But it's hard. I mean, I think for me, I'm a parent of two. I have two more on the way. Um, Talking about the issues of motherhood, of the forced abortions, things like that are really hard for me personally. And it's hard to just shut it off. Particularly, when you're really immersed in it like this. I think the best thing that you can possibly do is to understand that while these things are so horrible and hard to study, it is a way of paying remembrance and memorializing these people to comfortably learn about these stories in the comfort of my own home, even if it makes me feel uncomfortable. So that kind of gives me a little bit of peace in knowing that these things are really difficult to learn about. They were far worse to experience. And so if they could experience them, I could at least bother to learn about them and memorialize them. So again, not pretending I do it well all the time, but I do think that it's hard and it should be hard. It's not an easy thing to learn about. And perhaps when it gets easier is when we all need to ask ourselves, have we detached too much? But thank you.
Thank you. And I believe, Harriet,
Yeah,
you had raised
I
a hand.
I did. There was just a comment I wanted to make when someone said something about having other women around, other, help them survive. And I truly believe that happened with, my mother was a Holocaust survivor. And I believe that was true for her, because she was with her sister and another good friend of theirs, and they were able to be together the whole time. And I really think that was part of what kind of help them survive. Factor. And there are still things about her story. And the other thing I wanted to say when you were talking about the women guards in the concentration camps, I remember one thing my mother saying, that the women guards were far worse than the men. I remember her saying that. And there are still things I'm learning about her story from other family members that she told that I never knew. And unfortunately, now I can't ask her. There's nobody left I can ask those questions. So, but thank you for sharing everything you did today.
No, and thank you very much, because I think it's, it's an unbelievable testament to your mother and your aunt and the friend that they all survived together, and that I really do think that for so many of them, those relationships are what kept them going. But it's something that is just, it's difficult to talk about. I'm sure it was probably difficult for her to talk about. And it's hard knowing that we won't ever know everything. I think that's such a hard thing.
It was very difficult for her to talk about, but it got to a point when people started talking, she went all over. She's one of the Maine Holocaust survivors. And she went all over the state of Maine, she and my dad, talking to students in schools. I mean,
Oh, how beautiful.
that meant so much to her to do that, and how much these students, just these teenagers, would be, I mean, you could hear a pin drop. It was so quiet when she was speaking. And she just really felt it was very important for her to share her story. And she would put herself on another plane when she spoke. I could see it in her face, in her eyes. It was different.
Oh my gosh, that's wonderful. That's amazing that she was able to tell so many people about her story.
It was. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And Emily, I see you have a hand raised. Emily, can you unmute? I'm not hearing Emily, I'm afraid.
Maybe in the meantime, I can answer one of the questions in the chat that says, are there any books that you would recommend to learn more? There's a slew of books on women in the Holocaust that I would absolutely recommend. So I can always send that over to all of you after the fact if that's helpful at all. But Zoe Voxman is one of my favorite historians. I believe the book is literally called Women in the Holocaust, if I'm not mistaken. She's a feminist historian that really looks at some of these very difficult topics in depth. As I mentioned before, Hitler's Furies by Wendy Lauer is a really important book. Anything by Joan Ringelheim is also really, really helpful. She's one of the pioneers of Holocaust history, women's history. So there are many, many more that I could recommend, but if helpful, I can always send over, bibliography after bibliography later to Tam or anyone, if people want that.
Thank you. Is there anyone else? Emily, you are on in two different screens. So perhaps if you could unmute both of them, we might be able to hear if you do have a question. Ah, Ned here, husband of Emily. Thank you, Ned. I still can't hear you, but if you do have a question, please feel free to drop it into the chat. And if anyone else has a comment, a question, in the last sort of 3 or 4 minutes that we have before we will turn it back over to Tam to close out the evening for us. you know, we would love to hear.
Yes, Sybil Milton's work, Christine, that put in the chat, I would absolutely agree. There's so many women from that same era of academics that are doing so much of this early work that everyone else has built off of.
Aha, there you go. And thank you, Nick. Wondering about Gentile Germans who helped Jews survive. For example, those who helped Anne Frank survive, is the
Sure.
question from Ned.
Yes, so there are definitely people that were not Jewish that helped the Jews during the Holocaust. There's about, I believe, around 24-ish thousand people that are designated by Yad Vashem as righteous among the nations. So it's a very difficult distinction to get. You have to have a significant amount of, proven paperwork, eyewitnesses, basically proof showing that you didn't help a Jewish person because it was any personal benefit to yourself, nothing monetary, or anything like that, but that you did so because it was the morally right thing to do. So there are certainly many cases of those, not as many as we would like. 24,000 sounds really good until you think of the over 300 million people in Europe at the time, right? So there are certainly people that did amazing things, everyday people that helped their neighbors. Unfortunately, it just wasn't enough. You see this, of course, in the context, like you say here in Anne Frank's case. There, Miep Gies, who was her father's secretary, was one of the people that helped to hide the Frank family and the others that were in hiding. So what people sacrificed to help others during this period was really amazing and admirable. And many of them argue that they did so because they fell back on their pre-war thinking that if they were raised in a certain religion that really reinforced that you help others no matter what, that was something they were able to revert back to even during the Holocaust, during this awful period in World War II. But yes, there certainly were people that helped, but I also, as I mentioned earlier, don't want us to lose sight of the fact that the righteous among the nations often get most of the attention of those that helped the Jews during the Holocaust. And it's important to remember that Jews also helped Jews during the Holocaust too.
Thank you. And we're just about at time. So I am going to mute myself now and turn everything back over to Tam and but before I do, again, want to say thank you very much to Dr. Parks, and to all of you who came, who listened, and who commented and asked questions. So Tam, back to you.
Thank you, Erica. Just wanted to thank not only you, Dr. Parks, but everyone for participating in tonight's program. And certainly can't stress enough, Dr. Parks, how incredibly important it was for us to attend such a presentation where we learned so much about your scholarship and truly, really deepened what I knew about the Holocaust. I'll share with everyone our next program will be with former Secretary General of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, Dr. Catherine Meyer, and that will take place in January. Stay tuned for when registration opens. But again, thank you, Dr. Parks, and everyone have a good evening.
Thank you so much.